North Park Basin, Colorado, August 1901. The air held the bone-dry clarity of altitude, a brittle promise of the winter to come. On a slight rise overlooking the Laramie River, Janos Varga was doing something no one had ever seen before. He wasn't laying a foundation or digging a root cellar. He was setting posts. Massive cedar posts, 11 feet long, sunk 5 feet into the unforgiving earth, leaving 6 feet of timber reaching for the sky. Clive Pettibone, a man whose reputation was built on the unyielding logic of cattle yards and bunkhouses, reined in his horse. He watched Varga, a solitary figure of wiry muscle and quiet intent, wrestle another post into its hole with a block and tackle rigged to a tripod of lodgepole pine. Two other men, Silas Croft and Abel Finch, leaned on their wagon, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. 6 feet of air between your floor and the ground? Pettibone called out, his voice carrying the weight of established practice. What in God's name for, Varga? Janos straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at the circle of posts, then at Pettibone. For the snow, he said, his Hungarian accent sanding the edges off the words. Croft let out a short, barking laugh. The snow'll just blow right under it, you fool. You'll have drifts to your floorboards and a gale whistling up through the cracks. Pettibone nodded, his gaze professional, analytical. He was not a malicious man, but he was a practical one, and this offended his sense of order. The wind, Varga. The wind under that hut will strip the heat faster than any stove can feed it. Every gust will suck the life right out of your fire. You're building a wind tunnel, not a home. It's the damnedest, most foolish thing I've seen in 20 years. Janos Varga offered no argument. He simply picked up his shovel and began tamping earth around the base of the post. Each thud a quiet, rhythmic answer. The men watched for another minute, shaking their heads at the mad Hungarian and his house on stilts, then turned their wagon back toward the modest cluster of sod-roofed cabins that constituted the settlement. The consensus was clear. The Varga family would not survive the winter in that strange contraption. What did this Carpathian bridge carpenter, a man who thought in terms of trusses and air currents, understand about the physics of convective lift that a lifetime of building on the frozen plains had missed? This story is about a different kind of thinking, about an immigrant's quiet genius and the brutal physics of a high-altitude winter. I promise you will learn precisely why a conventional cabin floor is a thermal disaster, and how a cushion of trapped air can defeat a force of nature. If you appreciate stories of ingenuity against the odds, consider subscribing to this channel, and let me know in the comments what's the most unconventional solution you've ever seen for a common problem. Janos Varga was not a frontiersman. He was not a rancher, a trapper, or a miner. In his homeland, nestled in the timber-rich slopes of the Carpathian Mountains, he had been a hidapito, a builder of bridges. His hands were accustomed to the heft of adze and saw, to the intricate joinery of massive timber trestles that spanned gorges and defied avalanches. He had spent his life working with the forces of tension, compression, and shear, but most of all, with the ceaseless flow of air. He built elevated granaries, structures designed to allow air to circulate freely, preventing rot and mold. He understood that air, depending on how you channeled it, could be a preserver or a destroyer. He had brought his wife, Ilona, and their 2 small children, Miklos and Zofia, to Colorado with the promise of land and a new life. They arrived too late in the season to build properly, and spent their first winter in a hastily constructed log cabin, a structure identical to those of their neighbors and praised by men like Pettibone for its tight chinking and solid roof. That winter, the cold was not an enemy at the gates. It was an occupying force within their home. It was a predator that lived in the floor. The memory of it was a physical ache in Janos's bones. He remembered the specific, intimate ways the cold had tormented them. The coffee, poured steaming from the pot, would skim over with a film of gray ice before it could be drunk. In the morning, the children's bootlaces, left by the stove to dry, would be frozen into stiff, unbendable wires. He remembered Ilona reaching for the sack of flour and recoiling as the corners, stiff with frost that had wicked up from the floorboards, crackled like dry leaves. They burned wood at a terrifying rate, the pot-bellied stove glowing a dull, angry red, yet the heat only ever rose to shoulder height. Their feet were perpetually numb, the floor a sheet of ice that leached warmth from their bodies day and night. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem was the ground. He had spent that winter staring at the frozen floorboards, his bridge builder's mind seeing not a floor, but a flawed structure coupled directly to an infinite, unmovable mass of cold. The conventional wisdom in North Park was simple: build low, build tight, and dig in. A cabin's foundation was its anchor against the wind, and its best defense against the cold. You laid thick sleeper logs directly on leveled ground, or, for a more permanent structure, on a shallow stone foundation. The earth itself was seen as an insulator. This was the collective experience of men who had come from the gentler climates of the Ohio Valley or the Midwest, where a bit of frost in the ground was a seasonal nuisance. They had no frame of reference for the geological reality of the North Park Basin. Here, at 8,000 feet, the ground was not an insulator. It was a thermal battery charged with unimaginable cold. By January, the frost line wasn't inches deep, it was feet deep. The frozen earth became a heat sink, a vast, subterranean glacier that possessed a practically infinite capacity to absorb thermal energy. The primary enemy wasn't the cold air outside the walls. It was the frozen planet beneath the floor. The process was a simple, brutal law of physics: conduction. Heat energy naturally moves from a warmer object to a colder object in direct contact. A cabin floor at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, resting on ground that was 10 degrees, would bleed thousands of BTUs of heat per hour. A constant, silent theft of warmth. A family could burn an entire cord of wood in a week just to fight the heat loss through their floorboards. You could see the evidence around every cabin in the settlement. In the depths of winter, the snow would melt in a perfect 2-foot perimeter around the base of the walls, not from the heat of the sun, but from the warmth hemorrhaging out of the house, into the surrounding soil. Clive Pettibone's bunkhouses were masterfully built by these conventional standards. The logs were scribed and fitted with masterful precision. The chinking was a dense, waterproof mixture of mud and lime. Yet every winter, his men complained of the same unshakable chill from the floor. They stacked their bunks higher, stuffed straw and old blankets under their mattresses, and kept the stoves roaring, all in a futile battle against the physics of conduction. The problem wasn't their craftsmanship. The problem was their entire philosophy. They were trying to overpower the cold, to fight it with more fuel and thicker walls. They saw the ground as a foundation to be built upon, a solid and dependable friend. They never suspected it was their greatest thermal enemy. Llanos Vargas' construction project became the settlement's primary source of summer entertainment. He worked alone, with Ilona and the children helping where they could. After setting the 11-foot cedar posts, he began building the floor. It was a marvel of carpentry, a bridge deck suspended in the air. He laid massive timber beams between the posts, cross-braced them for stability, and then laid down 2 layers of thick planking, with a layer of tar paper sandwiched between them. The result was a perfectly flat, solid wooden platform, 32 feet long and 20 feet wide, floating 6 feet above the ground. Next came the Quonset hut itself, a strange, half-cylindrical structure of corrugated steel, purchased as a kit from a mail-order catalog. The curved sheets were bolted together on the ground, and then Using his system of tripods and pulleys, Janos hoisted the entire shell onto the platform and bolted it down. The community's mockery intensified. "A tin can on stilts," Silas Croft declared to the men at the trading post. "The first real blizzard will peel it open like a sardine can." Pettibone was more analytical in his critique. He rode out again when Janos was nearly finished, this time dismounting and walking under the structure, his boots echoing on the hard-packed earth. He squinted up at the underside of the floor. "I'll grant you this, Varga. It's a fine piece of carpentry, straight and true, but it won't work." He pointed a thick finger upward. "You have 150 square feet of floor exposed to the wind. Let's say the air temperature is 0. A 30-mile-an-hour wind will make it feel like 40 below. That's the temperature your floor will be fighting. You'll have frost on the inside of your floorboards. You understand? The wind will carry away heat 100 times faster than still air." Janos was fitting the last piece of his puzzle, and it was the most important. He was enclosing the entire space between the posts, from the ground to the floor, with tightly fitted vertical planks. He was building a skirt around the stilts, creating a sealed, contained chamber of air beneath his home. He had left one small, closable hatch for access. He paused his work, hammer in hand. He looked at Pettibone, a man he respected for his skill, if not for his vision. "The air will be still," he said. It was all the explanation he would offer. Pettibone shook his head, a look of genuine regret on his face. "You're sealing in your own doom, man. That space will be just as cold as the outside. Only now the snow will pile up against those walls and crush them. You've taken a bad idea and made it worse." He mounted his horse and rode away, convinced he would be helping to dig the Varga family out before the spring thaw. The physics that Clive Pettibone and his neighbors understood was the physics of direct experience. Wind makes you colder. A thick wall is warmer than a thin one. The ground is solid. But Janos Varga was thinking about a different set of principles, ones he'd learned not in a house, but on a bridge trestle high in the mountains, where managing airflow was the key to preventing timbers from rotting or buckling under ice loads. The core of his design rested on two fundamental concepts: decoupling and convective lift. First, decoupling. By lifting his home 6 feet into the air, Janos had performed a radical act of thermal surgery. He had completely severed the connection between his living space and the massive heat-sucking engine of the frozen earth. The conductive heat loss that plagued every other home in North Park was, in his design, simply impossible. There was no direct pathway for heat to bleed from his floor into the ground. He had replaced a solid connection with a 6-foot cushion of air. But Pettibone's objection was valid in theory. If that cushion of air was subject to the howling winter winds, it would become a brutally efficient cooling system, a radiator working in reverse. This is where the second principle and the sealed plenum came into play. The enclosed space under the floor was not a crawl space, it was a thermal engine. Janos cut a small 6-inch square hole in the center of his floor, directly beneath the pot-bellied stove. He fashioned a simple metal duct that extended from the base of the stove down through the hole. When the stove was lit, it began to heat the air in the Quonset. As every frontiersman knew, hot air rises. This leads to the classic cabin problem: a hot ceiling and head and frozen feet. But in Varga's design, a portion of this rising heated air was drawn down into the duct by the very nature of convection. It filled the sealed plenum, the 6-foot deep chamber beneath the floor. With no wind to disturb it, this chamber of air slowly, steadily warmed up. The still air trapped between the ground and the floor became an insulator, a poor one initially, but far better than frozen soil. As the stove continued to run, the plenum air temperature would stabilize, perhaps at 35 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, instead of a floor at 50 degrees losing heat to a ground at 10 degrees, Janos had a floor at 60 degrees being warmed from below by a cushion of air at 40 degrees. The temperature differential was smaller, and more importantly, the floor was now gaining heat from the plenum, not losing it. The entire underside of his home became a massive, low-temperature, radiant heater. The floor itself was warm. The curved shape of the Quonset hut completed the system. The warm floor radiated heat upwards, and the semicircular ceiling, with no corners to trap cold air, promoted a gentle, continuous loop of circulation. Warm air rose, cooled slightly against the insulated steel walls, descended, and was drawn toward the warm floor to begin the cycle again. He had built a self-regulating convective engine. The mockery had lasted for a summer. The validation would be delivered by the cruelest winter in a decade. That November, the cold arrived not as a gradual decline, but as an invasion. A vast mass of Arctic air, a continental polar vortex, descended from Canada and settled over the Rocky Mountains. For 9 consecutive nights, the temperature in North Park did not rise above 31 degrees below zero. The wind was a constant, razor-sharp force, sculpting the endless snowfall into drifts that buried fences, barns, and the lower windows of cabins. The world was reduced to a universe of white, gray, and the shrieking of the wind. Inside the cabins of the settlement, life became a grim battle for survival. Silas Croft's well froze solid, 5 feet below ground. His family was forced to melt snow for water, a task that consumed precious firewood and filled their small cabin with damp, chilling steam. The logs of their walls, super chilled by the wind, were coated on the inside with a thick, sparkling layer of hoarfrost. They lived in a tight circle around their stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. At Pettibone's ranch, the situation was worse. The sheer weight of the snow caused a section of his main bunkhouse roof to collapse, dumping tons of snow onto the sleeping men. Miraculously, no one was killed, but they were forced to abandon the building and crowd into the main house, burning fence posts and broken furniture to keep the fires going. The cattle, huddled together for warmth in their corrals, began to die, frozen, standing up. In the Quonset hut on the hill, a different reality prevailed. The wind howled and screamed around the curved steel shell, but it found no purchase, no flat wall to batter against. The snow, instead of piling up against the walls and stressing the structure, simply swirled and eddied through the stilts, forming a deep, insulating drift underneath the plenum, further protecting the trapped air from the cold. Inside, there was a stillness, a profound and shocking quiet. The single stove, burning steadily with a modest diet of aspen and pine, kept the entire space not just habitable, but comfortable. The floor was the warmest surface in the room. Little Miklos and Zofia, who in the old cabin had been prisoners of their bunk beds, could sit directly on the floorboards and play with their wooden toys. The greatest marvel for Ilona was a simple domestic act that had been impossible for her last winter. On a shelf, a full 10 feet away from the stove, she placed a bowl of bread dough, covered with a cloth. In the steady, even warmth of the room, it began to rise. The smell of yeast, a scent of life and normalcy, filled the air. This was a victory more profound than any temperature reading. This was a home. There was one other sign, visible only to someone who knew what to look for. While every other structure in the valley was bearded with thick, menacing icicles, the underside of the Vargas floor had none. Instead, from a small gap in the plenum wall, there was a steady, slow drip of clear water. The heat trapped in the plenum was just enough to melt the frost that formed on its outer skin. The water fell onto the dry straw Janos had spread below, a tiny, life-giving pulse in the heart of the frozen world. It was proof that the engine was working. The great freeze finally broke in mid-January. A Chinook wind, warm and merciful, swept down from the mountains, and the temperature climbed 40 degrees in a single afternoon. The thaw was as dangerous as the freeze. The immense weight of melting snow and ice caused more roofs to sag and foundations to crack under the hydraulic pressure of the saturated ground. Clive Pettibone rode out on his sturdiest horse to survey the damage to his property and check on his neighbors. His face was a grim mask of exhaustion and loss. He had lost nearly a third of his herd. The bunkhouse was a ruin. As he crested the rise near the Laramie River, he fully expected to see Varga's tin can smashed flat or blown into the next county. Instead, he saw it standing serene and untouched, high above the sodden landscape. He urged his horse closer, his curiosity overriding his fatigue. And then he saw it. It was a detail so subtle and yet so profound, it stopped him in his tracks. Every cabin he had passed that day, including his own, was surrounded by a thick, ugly collar of ice. This was the meltwater from the roof and the heat-leaching foundation, refrozen every night into a solid ring that held the building in a frosty grip. But around the base of Llanos Varga's stilts, there was nothing. The ground directly beneath the Quonset was not just free of ice. It was nearly dry. The deep snow that had accumulated there had melted and soaked away into the unfrozen earth below. It was as if the hut inhabited a different season from the rest of the valley. Pettibone dismounted and walked slowly toward the structure. He stepped under the floor, into the space he had once called a wind tunnel. The air was still and held a faint, residual warmth, like a barn after the animals have left. He reached up and placed his bare palm flat against the underside of the floorboards. He had expected to feel a surface as cold and damp as a cellar stone. Instead, the wood was dry and shockingly neutral, holding no chill at all. He saw the patch of damp straw where the meltwater had dripped for weeks, proof of a constant managed warmth. He looked around at the bare ground, at the sturdy posts, at the dry floor above his head. All his life he had built things to resist the cold, to fight it. He had built on the ground, using its mass as an ally, and all his life the ground had betrayed him, silently stealing the warmth he fought so hard to create. Varga hadn't fought. He had withdrawn from the battle. Llanos emerged from the Quonset, carrying a bucket. He saw Pettibone standing beneath his home, and waited, his expression unreadable. The cattleman, a man not given to elaborate speeches, struggled for a moment to find the right words. He looked from the bare earth up to the warm floor. The sheer, simple genius of it settled upon him. He finally looked at Llanos, not with the condescension of a seasoned expert, but with the raw respect of a student. "You didn't build a floor, Varga," Clive Pettibone said, his voice quiet with awe. "You built a sky." News on the frontier traveled not by newspaper, but by horse and wagon, by men sharing stories over a fire. The tale of the Hungarian sky house became a piece of North Park folklore that winter. But it was a chance encounter that spring that turned it from a local curiosity into a regional innovation. His name was Alistair Finch, a surveyor for the Denver, Northwestern, and Pacific Railway, the ambitious line David Moffett was carving through the Rockies. Finch was tasked with a difficult problem, designing semi-permanent winter camps for the survey and construction crews in high-altitude passes, where the conditions were even more brutal than in North Park. His standard designs for insulated tents and log shelters were failing, with crews suffering from frostbite and sickness, and fuel costs becoming astronomical. Passing through the basin, he heard the story. Intrigued, he sought out Llanos Varga. Finch was an engineer, a man of numbers and diagrams. He listened as Llanos, with gestures and a few carefully chosen words, explained his thinking. Finch didn't need a lengthy explanation. He walked under the structure, took measurements, made temperature calculations in his head, and understood immediately. He saw not a strange hut but an elegant solution to the problem of ground-coupled heat loss. In his field notebook, he sketched a detailed diagram, the deep-set posts, the double-layered platform, the crucial sealed plenum, and the ducted stove. He labeled it the Varga Elevated Foundation. He wrote a technical bulletin, a 2-page document filled with dimensions, material suggestions, and a concise explanation of the thermal principles. The primary objective, he wrote, is to fully decouple the living quarters from the conductive heat sink of the permafrozen substrate. That bulletin was carried by rail and mule train to every depot and work camp along the Moffett Road. It was practical, replicable knowledge, perfectly suited to the railroad's needs. By the winter of 1903, more than a dozen sky cabins, as the workers called them, had been built along the line from Tolland to Arrow. The reports that came back were astonishing. Crews were healthier, morale was higher, and most importantly for the railroad's accountants, the camps were reporting fuel savings of up to 60% compared to the old ground-set shelters. The idea had spread. The quiet carpenter from the Carpathians had, without seeking fame or fortune, fundamentally changed how men survived the high-altitude winter. His knowledge, born of a different landscape and a different trade, had been freely given and eagerly received. What Janos Varga built in the Colorado high country was more than just a clever house. It was a physical manifestation of a principle that modern building science would take another 70 years to fully embrace and formalize. His enclosed warmed plenum was a primitive but remarkably effective version of what is known today as a conditioned crawl space. For most of the 20th century, the standard practice for raised foundations was to ventilate the crawl space, the troste de crawl space, based on the theory that airflow would prevent moisture buildup. But this created a major energy penalty, as it allowed cold winter air to flow directly under the floor, just as Clive Pettibone had feared. It was only in the late 1900s that building scientists proved that sealing and lightly conditioning a crawl space was a far superior strategy, creating a buffer zone that improved energy efficiency, moisture control, and indoor air quality. Varga's design anticipated this by nearly a century. His plenum, warmed by waste heat from the stove, created a semi-conditioned thermal buffer. His work was a piece of frontier vernacular architecture that contained the seed of a sophisticated modern engineering concept. He didn't have the vocabulary of BTUs per hour per square foot or R values, but he had an intuitive, physical understanding of the system. He knew that the ground was the enemy and that a pocket of still, controlled air was the ultimate shield. The story of the sky cabin is a reminder that the most advanced solutions are often born from the most fundamental insights, and that innovation doesn't always come from the laboratory or the university, but sometimes from the quiet mind of a craftsman facing a problem of survival. There is a philosophy embedded in the timber and steel of Janos Varga's design. The story of the American frontier is often told as a story of conquest, of men battling the wilderness into submission. They fought the forests with axes, fought the prairies with plows, and fought the winter with bigger fires and thicker walls. It was a narrative of opposition, of imposing human will upon a hostile environment. Clive Pettibone embodied this spirit. He was a good man, a strong builder, whose entire approach was to meet the force of winter with the force of his own labor. When the cold pushed, he built thicker. When the wind blew, he chinked tighter. His was a direct and honorable fight, but it was also a losing one. He was fighting an opponent with infinite resources. Janos Varga did not fight. His experience building bridges over mountain chasms had taught him a different lesson. You do not stop an avalanche. You build where it will not go. You do not stop the wind. You shape your structure to let it pass. His solution to the brutal Colorado winter was not to engage in a costly battle with the frozen earth. He simply refused the fight. He understood that the ground would always win. It was too big, too cold. Its capacity to absorb heat limitless. So he stopped fighting the cold ground and simply lifted his family above it. His innovation was an act of profound humility. It was an admission that some forces of nature are not meant to be conquered, but to be understood and accommodated. He did not defeat the cold. He sidestepped it. He built a small island of warmth and normalcy, not by attacking the winter sea, but by rising above its waves. It was a quiet victory, not of force, but of intelligence. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found the science and the history compelling, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. We believe the past holds powerful lessons for the present. Let us know in the comments. What other historical innovations deserve to have their stories told? The reconstructions and events depicted in this video are inspired by historical accounts and building practices for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized. The technical principles are based on real-world physics and historical techniques. Any application of these or similar methods today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety regulations, and with the consultation of qualified professionals. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.